Home invasions and break-ins are fairly common. This is why it's important to always lock your door at night. However, sometimes nothing can stop someone who truly wants in. In tonight's video, I will be telling 3 home invasion and break-in stories. A huge thank you to the writers. Remember, you can send in your own story to rylhstories@gmail.com. If you enjoy the video, a like and a comment is always appreciated. Subscribing if you're new is as well. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. I'm 18 and female, and have struggled with mild OCD for a long time. I won't go into detail, but one of my compulsions is to lock my sliding glass back door every night, 3 times perfectly. Though I'm medicated, I still have little things here and there that I must do. Locking the door is one of those things. Because if I don't, my brain tells me bad things will happen. I've been working on it though. And some nights I don't need to do it. But the days that I am stressed out, I must complete the task, lest I be tormented by my intrusive thoughts all night long. The ritual was never a problem until 2 days ago, when I noticed some wear on the locking mechanism. You see, the lock has never worked well. You kind of have to slam it and hold the little handle down so it locks properly, and the door cannot be slid open anymore. But this was different. There were little scratches on the latch that keeps the door from sliding. Normally I would freak out about this, but I was tired, and the door still locked. I locked it once and chalked it up to my siblings' roughhousing, and called it a night. The next night I went to go and lock my door the required 3 times. I had to do it more than that because the mechanism had more scratches on it, and a couple of chinks that made it so it wouldn't latch into place very well. Luckily I got it all 3 times, shut the blinds, and called it a night. Or I tried to. For context, I sleep on the daybed in the living room. It's quiet and comfy, and where I choose to be. The windows and back door are on the opposite side of the room facing me, and the crippling fear I have of being near windows, while it's dark outside, always ensures I keep the heavy-duty blinds shut tight. Absolutely no cracks of darkness are allowed to get in. Even the thought gives me the creeps. I did my usual post-door locking routine, brush my teeth, grab my favorite blankets, and queue up whatever YouTube has in store to help me fall asleep. As I was waiting for my eyes to drift close, I couldn't help but notice some sounds near the back door. It was rhythmic, a tapping on the siding outside my house. Being me, I immediately jumped to the conclusion that there is a serial killer outside trying to freak me out before he gets me. So still being me, I turn down my laptop and curl up under my blanket, and try to ignore what's happening outside. I was unsuccessful in my attempts to pretend nothing was wrong, because I noticed the sound change, from tapping on the siding of my house to tapping on the glass of the door. I tried to slow my breathing down, and calm my heart rate in hopes that whatever was out there couldn't hear me. The tapping stopped. The rhythm was stuck in my head by this point, so I felt the absence of the noise immediately. The sudden silence was quickly replaced by scratching on the glass and metal siding of the door. Like claws were scraping up against it. It was grainy and made my teeth feel gross. I felt the beginnings of a panic attack starting in my throat and stomach as the sound continued. I tried rationalizing to myself, but every explanation had an easy way to debunk it. I live in a nice neighborhood. There are no trees near the window or door. The weather was perfect today, and my dog is a Chihuahua. He couldn't produce that noise if he wanted to. I heard the click of the lock being jangled around, and the scratching stopped. I slowed my breathing once again, hoping that whoever or whatever had gotten bored and left. The room felt colder, and I tightened my blanket around me as I worked up the courage to peek over my laptop screen at the door. 4 huge dark talons were gripped around my curtain. I froze, trying to process what I was seeing. The room was growing colder and I was having a hard time breathing. They were at least 2 feet long, and curved. They started tapping in that same rhythm again. "Tell that dog to shut up." The voice of my father interrupted my panic, and the claws swiftly disappeared. I heard the door latch, and the curtain swung back into place, all in a matter of seconds. I lay there silent and still for I don't know how long, and woke up the next morning as if nothing had happened. Remember the medication I mentioned earlier? It comes with some side effects that may explain last night's terrifying event. Because of this medication, I am constantly tired. I get 8 hours of sleep a night, and then take about 4 naps during the day to keep me functioning. Another side effect I have is extremely vivid dreams. I often wake up not being able to understand that I was asleep, and a lot of these times I am sleeping. I'm having nightmares. I can't count the number of odd and horrifying things that I've experienced in these vivid nightmares. Often they are related to my fears in the real world, like windows and supernatural creatures. Last night could have easily been one of those nightmares. At least, this is what I have told myself all day at school to keep me sane. Now that I'm back at home, and the sun is setting, it's time to go lock the door 3 times, just like any other night. I take a deep breath and yank back the curtain. All is well. My backyard is still messy. The sky is turning those pretty colors of a spring sunset. I'm calmer now. I can get through this. I open the door so I can slam it shut while I hold the lock handle. Like I said, it's not a very well-functioning lock. I look down and my heart drops. The latch is missing. It's completely gone. There is no way to keep the door closed. The panic sets in. My throat closes and my muscles clench. I'm frozen at the open door for at least 2 minutes. Not just because of the fear of my lock being gone, but because I have OCD and I cannot perform my ritual of locking the door. The thoughts swirl in my head that something bad will happen, because I have not locked the door 3 times. The monster will get me. My dad will die at work tomorrow. My boyfriend will get injured in a fight, because I cannot lock the door. What happened last night was clearly not a nightmare. This is what happens if I don't lock the door 3 times perfectly. The bad thing comes to get me. As I come back into my body and the adrenaline wears out, I slowly slid the door closed and wobble my way back through the house. I brush my teeth mechanically, locate my favorite blanket, and instead of logging into YouTube, I go to Reddit. I guess I'm all caught up with you guys now. That's all the interesting stuff that has happened so far. I don't know if I'll be able to sleep tonight. I don't know if I'll be here in the morning, but I guess I'll say goodnight anyway. This is what I get for not locking that door correctly. I know this is long, but it's important for you to hear my story. It started off so nice and innocently. I never saw anything coming. And here's your room key, ma'am. Your room is number 422. I said with a mandatory smile as I gave the key card to the young couple on the other side of the desk. Thank you so much. The woman responded with a genuine smile before taking the key. Then she and her husband walked over to the long hallway of doors and disappeared around the corner. A little backstory. I'd been working the night shift at the North Peak Motel, and I wasn't exactly looking forward to it. It was 8:30 in the morning at this point, and I was close to being done with my shift, but I still had to put on a happy face for all the customers. It wouldn't be right to let anyone suffer because of my own problems, even if they really deserved it. But it would be alright. Everything would be fine. Well, how much worse could things get after last night? There had been a big concert in town the night before, and it seemed like the entire audience had decided to stay at the North Peak that day. The motel needed all the staff we could get, so I had to work that night. There was a period of time during the concert where the motel was quiet and peaceful, but that soon ended when the concert ended and everyone returned to the motel. It was loud and rambunctious throughout the entire night. The halls were filled with drunks, and several of the decorative pictures hanging on the walls were shattered by morning. We tried our hardest to keep everyone in their rooms and to get them to stay quiet, but our attempts were futile. A small group of motel workers could never overpower a hyped crowd of blasted concert goers. Eventually we stopped trying, so we let the crowd die down when they inevitably crashed. Then at about 4 in the morning, the motel went quiet. All was still. We went around to all the rooms and found that almost everyone had fallen into a deep sleep. Many of them were laying sideways or dangling off the sides of beds. Some of them seemed to have fallen asleep standing up, but we simply let them be. We knew that the crowd would be terribly zombie-like in the morning. By the time the sun was up, almost the entire concert crowd had left the motel. After a few hours, the rest of them trudged out the door. It was quiet again, so quiet, and it stayed that way all day. I left a few hours after morning broke, but I knew I was scheduled to come back later that night, so I flopped down on my bed as soon as I got home and went straight to sleep, while still wearing my work uniform. At 6 in the evening, my alarm startled me awake. I stumbled around the room in an effort to silence the alarm, but it took almost a full minute for my vision to focus, and by that time, the alarm had already shut off by itself. I stood up as straight as possible, and did my best to shake away as much sleep as I could. I looked over at my bathroom where an empty shower waited to be used. I looked down at my wardrobe, then back at the shower. Nah, I said to myself, as I proceeded downstairs and began getting ready for my shift. Once at work, I used as much of my downtime to recall the huge mass of people who had occupied the motel less than 24 hours before. I listened to the deafening silence which currently engulfed the North Peak and surrounded my eardrums. I would often question if there was anyone staying in the hotel at all. I had to frequently check the book of rooms to reassure myself that many rooms were occupied that night. Suddenly a scream shook the entire hotel to its foundation. I found that I had dozed off because the shriek startled me completely awake. I became more alert than I had been that entire day. I looked at the clock on the wall, 1:28 a.m. It wasn't even close to morning yet, but that didn't matter. I needed to find out what made that horrible sound. It sounded like whatever screamed was suffering a great amount of pain, but I couldn't even tell where it was coming from. I began frantically running around to all the rooms in the motel. I knocked on every door and asked if everyone was alright inside. Many rooms gave no answer. I assumed that was because the motel was halfway vacant at this point. I noticed that several more guests had walked out of their rooms to see what the source of the scream was as well. They too had been startled by it. Many looked scared and jumpy, while others appeared to be lazily limping to their doorways. I asked many of the guests if they heard where the scream had come from. Many of them didn't know, because they too had been sleeping when they heard it. A few of them said they had heard it coming from the far end of the hallway. They also said they'd been hearing strange noises coming from there all day. I thanked them, and told all the guests to return to their rooms. I explained there was nothing to be concerned about, but several of the guests clearly didn't buy this excuse. I didn't even buy it myself. Once all the other residents' doors were closed, I sprinted down to the end of the hallway and knocked on a few of those doors. There was no response from any of them, but then I heard another sound come from one of the rooms. It sounded like running water. But this wasn't completely abnormal. It was a motel after all. Nonetheless, I walked over to the door of the room that was making the water sounds. But when I knocked on the door and no one answered, I could feel something inside me sink way down. I couldn't describe it. I shouldn't have had any reason to feel this way, but I couldn't help it. I looked at the number on the door. 422. My stomach sank farther. My brain and gut knew what to do next, but the rest of me was still quite hesitant. I slowly reached into my pocket and pulled out the master key. I swiped it on the key slot, but my hand acted slowly as it sluggishly reached for the doorknob. After my palm touched the handle, I froze for a moment. I slowly counted down from 3, 2, 1. I turned the handle as quietly as possible, as not to disturb any potentially sleeping guests. But honestly, who could still be sleeping after that horrific screech? The door creaked open, but I hoped that the sound of the water would muffle the door slightly. I stepped into the room, and was slightly shocked at what stood before me. The room was entirely dark, but the light from outside bled in through the doorway, which gave me clear sight of the room. The shower was indeed on, but I could see that the bathroom was a mess of various shades of red that had been splattered all over the walls and floor. The typical main room setup at the North Peak Motel consists of 2 master beds, a pull-out couch, a television set, a wooden bench, and several pictures framed on the wall. But there was only 1 or 2 pictures left in the room because of the huge party after the concert the night before. I looked into the room and saw that the carpet had been randomly ripped up throughout the room. It was near perfect in some spots, and completely gone in others. The gray stone floor underneath was very visible. The wooden bench against the back wall had been broken into many small pieces. One of the pieces appeared to have been sharpened until it reached a dangerously pointy tip. Most of that piece was a deep red. Strange and grotesque images had been drawn with Sharpie onto the few remaining framed pictures in the room. The TV screen had been completely smashed, and the glass was lying on the floor all around the room. The remaining back of the TV had been yanked out and placed onto one of the pieces of wood and was being used as a makeshift flag of some sort. The pull-out couch had been flipped completely upside down, with several springs proudly poking out from the bottom side. The entire bed portion of the couch had been yanked out and thrown on top of one of the actual beds. I couldn't see much of this bed, but the other bed looked like it had come straight out of A Nightmare on Elm Street. It was completely soaked in a substance that I could only assume was blood. The springs of the bed were also massively protruding, and standing erect in the center of the sheets like a broken jack-in-the-box. The pillows had been shredded down to the bare feathers and thrown across the room. Overall, the entire room looked like it had been drenched with a bucket of red paint, and smelled like it had been sprayed with a can of raw sewage. Then something else touched the light. A person. A man rose from the shadows and stared directly at me. I nearly jumped. I didn't recognize this person at all. It didn't look anything like the man who had checked into the room earlier that day. I was horrified enough at the mere sight of the room, but now I found out there was another person in there. How long was he there? What had he done? Where was that couple? The man began to walk towards me with a completely blank expression. I couldn't read him at all. He didn't show any joy nor fear in what he'd done. I began slowly backing out of the room. The man followed me at a near limp. My slow walk turned into a speed walk, and it soon turned into a complete sprint for my life. The man's pace quickened with mine. He was nearly on top of me by the time I reached the doorway. Without another thought, I reached the door and slammed it directly in the man's face. I heard him fall onto the floor behind the door. I quickly reached for my key, but as I was searching, the door pounded open. The man aggressively reached out towards me with death in his eyes, but I pushed the door closed again. It was a vicious battle with the door being pushed open and held tightly shut, as I struggled to find my key. I suddenly spotted the small key card laying on the ground directly next to my feet. I looked back and forth between the key and the door, which was still being restlessly shoved from the other side. I knew the moment I reached down for the key, the door would be pushed open, so I stayed put for a moment and attempted, with little success, to reach for the key with my feet. Eventually the pushing stopped for a moment. I closely listened. I heard footsteps walking away from the door. Then I heard several loud stomps running towards the door, followed by a massive bang on the wood. The impact pushed me back a substantial amount. I quickly pushed the door shut again, but I realized he was trying to ram his way through the door. One more big hit would cause the door to come flying open for sure. The footsteps walked away from the door once more. I used this short grace period to reach for the key card. I picked it up, but heard the footsteps quickly coming back towards the door. I swiped the card on the lock and heard a faint click. I backed as far as I could from the door. The next thing I saw was the door suddenly getting a massive hole in the center, and the man's head was sticking right through it. He tried to bring his head back in, but he couldn't. He was stuck like a child who puts his head in between the bars of a banister. Any movement he made would only allow the wood to scratch his neck more and more. I quickly ran to the nearest room with a resident in it, and told him to call the police. When they arrived at the motel 5 minutes later, the man's head was still tightly lodged inside the hole of the door. He had clearly tried to escape because his neck had several deep cuts from the jagged wood. The authorities carefully unlocked the door and arrested him immediately. After asking me about what had happened, they told me to go home for a while. I happily agreed. I needed some time for myself to distress about what I had witnessed in the past 2 minutes. "What happened in that room, officer?" I asked worriedly. The policeman looked over his shoulder at the room that no longer had a door in the entryway. "I have no idea." He turned back to me, "But my team's gonna get on that immediately and thoroughly investigate the entire ordeal." The officer paused and inhaled, "And we will also find the bodies of that poor couple." I tensed upon hearing about them again. I didn't want to think about what gruesome fate awaited those two. I did as I was told and went home for a much-needed rest. I couldn't tell exactly how long I had been away from work. I felt calm, more calm than I had felt in years. But the memory of it all still haunted me, every time I saw a wooden door or a broken television, or anything that I had seen in that room. All the echoes of that night would come flooding back. I would slump farther into sadness and stress. I kept telling myself to relax, but it didn't work. It never worked. Eventually I got a call. It was at about 3 in the afternoon. and I had had a long sleep the night before. I picked up the telephone before it finished ringing once. Ever since I had been home, I was anxiously awaiting the call from the police that would tell me all I wanted to know. Hello? I answered immediately after picking up the phone. My tone was tense and hurried. I probably shouldn't have been so jumpy about this. I didn't even know if it was the police or not.
Good afternoon, ma'am.
The officer spoke calmly and collected, as you'd expect from a man of the law.
We have been examining the scene of the crime for weeks now.
Weeks? Has it really been that long? It certainly doesn't feel that long.
And we believe we have found enough evidence to put together a large amount of a conclusive situation.
I paused for a moment. Excuse me? I could hear the officer give a slight disapproving sigh on the other line.
Based on our evidence, my team and I have put together a story that we believe is the closest thing to what actually happened.
That's great. I could hardly contain my joy. This is what I had been waiting for all this time.
Do you want to come down to the station so we can tell you?
The officer asked. No, I shouted, nearly cutting him off. I've waited a long time for this. I don't think I can wait another minute. The other line went silent for a moment.
Alright, if you want.
I sat up in my chair and prepared myself. I could sense the officer readying himself to tell me.
The man who chased you out of the room attended the concert the night before.
The officer gave me his name, but I didn't recognize it.
We believe he hid somewhere in the room while the hotel staff went to clean it up. After they left, he started to absolutely trash the room. We still aren't entirely sure why. We think it may have had something to do with the combination of the hallucinogenic drugs and alcohol he consumed the night before. He was highly unstable before, and these only increased his agitation. After a little while, that couple came into the room, but as soon as they saw what happened, they attempted to leave. However, that man grabbed both of them and dragged them both back into the room. We found several pieces of rope and cloth with saliva on it. We suspect that the man tied the couple up and stuck cloths in their mouth to silence them. We still aren't exactly sure what he did to them, but we can guarantee that none of them should have ever been done to anyone. If we tried him for even one of these acts, he would surely go to jail for life. We aren't entirely sure how long he tortured them either, but we do know that he eventually took the woman's cloth away from her mouth because she screamed for help. That's the scream you heard, ma'am.
The officer paused for a moment to let me gather my thoughts for a moment.
After that, he probably took the couple somewhere else to be punished.
Wait. I stopped him. So where did he take them? The officer hesitated.
We've searched for them all over the place for the past 2.5 weeks, but there's no sign of them.
I began to rapidly hyperventilate.
Ma'am, calm down. We will find them. My team will not rest until we...
I gave that couple the key to the hotel room. I could have given them any other room, but I had to choose that one. It's my fault they walked into that room. It's my fault they got captured and tortured like that by that monster. It's my fault they went missing, and it's my fault they're probably dead. I began to weep bitterly. I had lost all hope.
It's not your fault.
The officer attempted to console me.
You had no idea that man was in there. He could have been in any of those rooms. You forget that you were also the one who called us to come over there and capture him. I doubt any other person could have done that.
None of this was making me feel any better. My tears and sniffling was stopping, but I still felt the same depression inside. When the officer didn't hear me respond, he spoke again.
The motel called yesterday and said they've cleaned that room completely. They said it looks spotless. They replaced all the furniture except for one of the beds, which was still in perfect working order. When you are ready, you can return to the motel if you wish.
I anxiously inhaled and exhaled as I tried to gather myself. What's going to happen to that man?
Oh.
The officer didn't expect this question.
He's going to go to jail for life at the very least. We have enough evidence on him that even the worst lawyer could win against him. You probably won't even have to testify.
I didn't respond.
Ma'am, everything will turn out fine. I guarantee it.
I knew deep down that this was a lie, but I wanted it to be true so badly. I tried my hardest to trust the officer. Thank you, I answered simply. The next day I went to work in the motel once again. The rest of the staff was overjoyed to see me, but I barely reciprocated the response. I said that, before anything, I wanted to see room 422. No one disputed me. They gave me the key card and told me attendance at the North Peak had significantly decreased since the news of the incident broke, and no one had dared to stay in that room. I opened the door to the room just like I did only a few weeks before. It looked as if nothing at all had happened in that room. But everywhere I looked, I could see the memories of what had been there before. The horrible, scarring memories. I could see it all. Even though the room now looked like every other hotel room, I could still see everything. It wasn't going to leave. The memories of that room would never leave my mind. It was strange to think that I was only in there for a few less than a minute, but it changed my life forever. I looked over at the bed on the far side of the room, the only remaining item in the room from that night. It was the same bed that had been drenched in blood and had a couch bed thrown on top of it. The sheets had all been washed and changed, but it was still the same bed underneath. I looked at it with hatred. I walked over to the horrid reminder of that night. Why did it have to look so comfortable and beautifully furnished? I raised my fist into the air and slammed down onto the sheets. It didn't do anything, but it made me feel a little better inside. I pounded on the bed for over a minute, but eventually I began to break down again. "I'm sorry," I yelled at the sky. I still wasn't convinced that the couple was alive. I also still believed that I was the sole reason for their suffering. I put my head down on the bed and sobbed. I felt completely defeated. Then I felt something strange. It felt like one of the mattresses was hard underneath. I had felt it a little when I was punching the sheets, but I didn't pay attention to it then. I was in too much of a rage. I felt around the bed for where the hard spot could have been coming from, but there was no specific point where it stopped or started. It was just all around the bed. I was highly curious, so I ripped off the comforter and the fitted sheets underneath. I found the bed had 2 mattresses, just like all the other beds at the motel, but this one was different. The 2 mattresses seemed to be slightly separated. It was as if something was in between the mattresses and was keeping them apart. I immediately grabbed the top mattress and dragged it off the bed. Before I even saw what was under, I could immediately tell that the smell that was in the room all those weeks ago had returned as soon as the mattress was removed. I clenched my nose and looked to see what had been hidden inside the bed. And there, lying directly beside each other with neat positioning, were the bodies of the couple who had checked into the hotel less than a month earlier. They were barely recognizable, but I knew exactly who it was. It was the people to whom I had given the room key. It was the people who had been tortured horrifically for an entire day. Their bodies had been stabbed and sliced in many different places. They were lying in a large pool of their own blood. Neither of them were moving. Neither of them were breathing. Neither of them were living by any means. I quit my job that day. This all started a couple days ago, and only just came to a head tonight. I'll do my best to explain the situation, but I'm still a bit unsettled, so bear with me if some of this is a bit disjointed. I live in a regular suburban area. Low crime rate, nice neighbors, everyone knows each other type of deal. My wife and I moved in maybe a year ago, maybe a little longer. And we were always right at home. We're planning a family and the school district here is a good one, which was a major contributing factor to our choosing this location. Every second Wednesday, we host a little get-together with our neighbors. It's a bit of fun. We all gather around the barbecue with some good stories, beer, and a few laughs. This week our neighbor from 3 houses down, Mr. Yu, got a little carried away and dove into our pool fully clothed, before getting dragged away by the ear of Mrs. Yu. Samantha from directly next door brought around her 6-year-old triplets to play with our dog, Spike, who is a lovable blue American Staffy. My wife also managed to find out that our neighbor across the road, 83-year-old Margaret, was having an affair with a mysterious man in the nursing home, a couple streets over. Quite the scandal for the area. Cleanup after was the usual. Pile everything into the kitchen so the rest of the place looked clean, and sort through it slowly. That it always is. And I was washing the dishes while she sorted out what was rubbish and what wasn't. That's when I heard her hesitate and mutter something under her breath. What was that? I asked curiously, turning to see her holding a twine and fabric doll-like thing. What is that? I corrected my question. I have no idea, but isn't it the creepiest doll you've ever seen? She asked in her soft British accent, and held the creation out to me, looking at it with its beady black button eyes burning into my soul, and its scraggly thread hair sticking upright. I had to agree. Yeah, that's disturbing. Where did it come from? I questioned. It was just in the pile of rubbish here. I think it must have been one of the kids. She answered, turning it over in her fingers. Do you think they'll want it back? I think you're pretty safe to throw it away, I assured after a moment's thought. The thing was a nightmarish voodoo doll wannabe. I'm sure it wasn't going to be missed, and I figured we'd probably be doing Samantha a solid in removing it. I heard it drop into the bin, and thought nothing more of it. The following day, my wife's house keys went missing. She kept them with her car keys, and her car keys were still there. It's just that the specific key for our house was missing from the chain. At the time, we shrugged it off as probably having fallen off, and gotten lost somewhere, so we didn't think anything of it. That's when the other strange things started to happen. I woke up one morning to find the doll my wife had thrown out sitting on a used plate in the kitchen. My first thought was, of course, that my wife's weird British humor had surfaced, and that she was messing with me, but her reaction when I asked her was genuine confusion, which put sparks of doubt into my mind. It went straight back in the bin, and from then on, even more odd occurrences began to happen. Things would go missing. Books, toilet paper, my lighter, food. Twice I'd woken up in the middle of the night to the call of nature, and walked past the kitchen to see the fridge cracked open slightly, with its bright light beaming out into the darkness of our kitchen. There were so many weird things we ignored. My wife found fabric softener empty in our laundry, and assumed I'd split it, and forgotten to tell her or something. Well, I dismissed the instances I had noticed as her forgetting or trying to prank me. Even our dog started acting weird. He refused to go near the kitchen. He was restless, constantly pacing back and forth down the hallway, or in the bedroom. Nothing would calm him. That all brings us to earlier this evening. My wife and I were just settling into bed when we heard a soft thump from the kitchen. I paused in taking off my pants, and my wife sat up in bed to listen. As we waited for another sound, Spike growled in a low guttural tone, and moved slowly out of the room and into the hallway. I told my wife to have the phone ready to call 911, and cautiously followed Spike into the darkness. I found him stopped at the top of the hallway stairs. His muscular frame was tense, and his hackles raised. He was sniffle growling, and barking occasionally in the most vicious manner I'd ever heard. I strained my eyes looking into the gloom, trying to see what he was seeing, but I couldn't see anything. It was too dark. The minutes passed and nothing happened, so I began to shrug it off as our imaginations. However, just as I began to turn back to our bedroom, the smallest movement in the dark caught my attention. Something was down there. Spike could see it, and I could just barely see the shape of someone there, and so I called out, "Leave now and we won't call the police." There was a long moment of silence before the most deafening, inhuman wail I have ever heard erupted from the being below, and I scrambled to grab Spike and run back to the bedroom. I heard heavy footsteps shambling rapidly up the stairs as I slammed our bedroom door shut, and leant my full weight back against it. My wife by then was already on the phone to the police, and as whatever it was slammed itself against our bedroom door repeatedly, I hoped to God they would arrive in time. As it were, the slamming stopped mere moments before the red and blue lights washed in through our window. We didn't open the door until an officer identified himself, and when we came out, it was with caution. The first thing we noticed was the creepy doll we'd thrown out several times was crucified to our door, with a knife straight through it. The second thing we noticed was the footprints, bloody human footprints leading away from the door to a wall crawl space located at the back of the kitchen pantry. We're at a hotel for the night at the moment. Police have searched the house, and what they found sends a shiver up my spine. Upon investigating the crawl space, they found what they believed to be someone's nesting area. There were dirty blankets, empty food and drink containers, and my wife's house keys, among other items. They assume the guy cut himself stabbing the doll into our door, but they so far haven't found the guy, and don't have any idea where he could have gone. There was no other way out of the crawl space, and no other footprints leading anywhere else. I just wanted to tell someone, since there's no way I'm going to be able to sleep tonight. That scream still echoes in my mind. It makes me question whether it was even a man at all.